Something strange happens to a man after 40. And I don't mean strange in a bad way. I mean strange in the way that things become strange when you look at them honestly for the first time. Because the psychology of a man in the second half of his life, what he wants, what he fears, what quietly starts to matter, is genuinely different from what he expected. And almost nobody prepares you for it. I've been paying attention to this for a while, to the specific ways men change after 40. Not the obvious ones, not the physical ones, the interior ones, the shifts in what produces a sense of meaning, the things that used to feel important, that gradually stop, the things that never felt important, that start to feel essential. And what I keep finding in myself and in men I talk to is that the psychology of midlife is stranger and more interesting than either the crisis narrative or the contentment narrative suggests. It's not a breakdown. It's not a peaceful arrival. It's something more complicated than both. Something that deserves more honest examination that it usually gets. Here's one of the first things I notice. After 40, a man's relationship with other people's opinions starts to quietly transform. When you are younger, social perception is almost structural. What people think of you, how you are regarded, how you come across, isn't just vanity. It's part of how you know who you are. You're still building the self. And the reactions to the world around you are part of the construction material. But after 40, something loosens. The need for external validation doesn't disappear entirely, but it loses its grip. And what replaces it is strange. Because it's not arrogance, it's not cynicism, not withdrawal. It's more like a quiet shift of jurisdiction. The court that matters moves from the outside to the inside. And the man starts evaluating his choices, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, against an internal standard, rather than an external one. Most men notice this, but don't know what to call it. They just feel a little less interested in the performance, a little more interested in whether the thing they're doing actually means something to them. But here is the strange part. That shift from external to internal, that shift in jurisdiction, which sounds like a freedom, and often is, also creates a specific kind of loneliness that most men never talk about. Because when the performance drops, when you stop organizing yourself around other people's expectations, the question of who you actually are becomes impossible to avoid. And most men, when they arrive to that question honestly, find that the answer is less settled than they expected. The external identity, the provider, the role, is clear. But the interior identity, the private values, the genuine desires, the things that matter to this specific man in this specific life, for reasons that have nothing to do with how they look. For a lot of men, that landscape is surprisingly unmapped. This is where things become interesting, because the strange psychology of men after 40 is partly the psychology of the man who has spent decades building an external self and is only now, with some urgency, beginning to explore the internal one. And there's another thing that shifts after 40 that I find genuinely fascinating: the relationship with time. Not just the awareness that time is finite, that comes earlier. Something more specific. A change in how a man experiences the present moment relative to the future. When you're younger, the present is mostly infrastructure, a means to get somewhere, the sacrifice in service of the goal ahead. You tolerate the presence, you move through it. The real life, the version you're actually building toward, exists in the future. But after 40, something shifts in that relationship. The future stops being the primary address. Not because it's given up on, but because the present starts to feel, for the first time really, like the place where life is actually happening. Not where it will happen, where it is happening right now. And that shift, subtle as it sounds, changes everything, almost everything, about what matters. The conversation at dinner becomes more important. The walk in the afternoon becomes more real. The ordinary Tuesday carries a different weight than it did when every Tuesday was just infrastructure for the goal. Most men never notice this shift as it's happening. They just find themselves less interested in next year and more interested in this afternoon. And this is where things become interesting. Because that's not disengagement. That is not disengagement. That's presence. Arriving, finally, in the life that was always happening. And something changes after 40 in a man's relationship with solitude. When you're younger, being alone is often something to escape. The noise, the company, the constant stimulation, it keeps the interior questions at a manageable distance. But after 40, something reverses. The solitude starts to feel less like absence and more like company. The company of your own actual thoughts, your own actual questions, the version of yourself that only surfaces when there's no audience and no performance required. And this is a strange development for men who spent their 30s in a near constant state of external orientation. Suddenly, the quiet walk, like this one, is not something to feel. is something to inhabit. The drive alone, the early morning, before the house wakes up. The small pockets of solitude that used to feel like gaps between real life. They start to feel like real life. Most men never notice this shift until it's well underway. They just know that they need their own company more than they used to. That the noise bothers them differently now. That they're developing, for the first time, a genuine interior life. Here's what I think is really happening in the psychology of men after 40. The first half of a man's life is largely centrifugal. The energy moves outward, toward building, achieving, establishing, and performing. The world asks things of him, and he responds. He adapts, he produces, he shows up. And that outward orientation is real and necessary and worth honoring. But at some point, usually somewhere in the middle of the fourth decade, the centrifugal force starts to slow. And something centripetal begins. The energy starts moving inward. Not in a like a self-absorbed way. Not at the expense of the people he loves. Just inward, toward the questions that the outward motion was too loud to hear. What do I actually believe? What have I been carrying that was never mine to carry? And what would I choose? Freely, without a reference to expectation. If I were choosing only for myself. And the strange psychology of men after 40 is the psychology of that centripetal turn. A man learning for the first time in his adult life to be genuinely interested in his own interior. To take his own experiences seriously, to give his inner life the same attention and care he has always given to the outer one. And this is strange, because it's unfamiliar. It's unfamiliar. And it's uncomfortable, because it's honest. And it's also, I believe this deeply, one of the most important things a man can do in his second half of his life. I want to ask you something that I've been thinking about for a while. What surprises you about yourself after 40? Not the obvious stuff, not the physical changes. What surprises you about what you care about now versus what you cared about then? What surprises you about what you find yourself wanting or no longer wanting in ways you didn't expect at 30. Because for most men, the psychology of this decade doesn't match the story they were told about it. They expected the decline or crisis or resignation. What they find, if they're paying attention, is something stranger but richer than any of that. A self that is more honest than it used to be, more patient with uncertainty, more willing to sit with questions rather than demanding immediate resolution, more interested in depth than in appearance, more capable of being genuinely moved by things that the younger version would have managed past. Maybe you've noticed this in yourself. The way certain things hit differently now. The way beauty or grief or ordinary love sometimes lands with a weight it didn't carry before. That's not softness. That's a man becoming more fully himself. The strange psychology of men after 40 is strange because it doesn't fit any of the stories. Not the crisis story, not the decline story, not the midlife reinvention story. It is quieter than that. It is quieter than all of those, and in many ways, more significant. It's the psychology of a man becoming more genuinely himself than he was permitted to be in the first half. Less performed, less reactive to external pressure, more rooted in something internal and real. More willing to be honest about what he wants, what he has outgrown, and what he's only beginning to understand. And this process, slow, imperfect, unglamorous, produces something that most men don't have a word for. Not happiness. At least not a happiness exactly. Not contentment exactly either. Something more like integrity. The experience of your outer life and your inner life moving toward each other, of what you do and who you are, becoming less contradictory, of a man who has stopped pretending as much as he used to, and actually started living, however imperfectly, but living from something closer to the truth of himself. I don't think we give this enough credit. The strange, quiet, interior work that happens in a man after 40. It doesn't make headlines, it doesn't produce dramatic transformations. It just slowly, persistently, almost invisibly makes a man more real, more present, more honest with himself and with the people around him, more capable of the kind of love and attention that actually makes a difference in another person's life. And I think that's worth naming, not as an achievement, just as a recognition that the second half of a man's life, strange and uncertain and unmapped as it is, might be more interesting than the first one. Might be the more interesting half of your life. That half where the real work actually begins.